The U.S. Naval War College is the Navy's home of thought. Established in 1884, NWC has become the center of naval sea power, both strategically and intellectually. The following Issues in National Security lecture is specifically designed to offer scholarly lectures to all participants. We hope you enjoy this upcoming discussion and future lectures.
Good afternoon and welcome to our second Issues in National Security lecture for this academic year. I'm John Jackson and I will serve as host for today's event. I'd like to note that we're gathered here together in person and also have a large audience dialed in on Zoom. Particularly pleased to have young officers from the Navy Supply Corps School, Naval Justice School, other branches of OTCN, and Admiral Verma. We're very pleased to have you with us this afternoon, so welcome one and all. Over the 2024-25 academic year, we will be offering 10 lectures from some of the best scholars in the world from our resident faculty. This is intended to share a portion of the Naval War College's academic experience with the spouses and significant others of our student body. We also welcome participation by the entire Naval War College extended family, including members of the Naval War College Foundation, international sponsors, civilian employees, colleagues throughout Naval Station Newport, and others from around the globe. While the primary purpose is to share information and learn together, we do offer documentation in the form of certificates of completion to all participants who attend at least 70% of the offered lectures. You can participate here in the audience, via Zoom, or even by watching the presentations when we post them on YouTube. So we ask you to keep track of how and when you participate, and we'll ask you to self-certify your completion toward the end of the series. Let me highlight the schedule for the rest of the academic year. A little hard to read some of that, but I'll touch base. After today's lecture on the 11th of February, we'll be talking about China's Navy. 25 February, we'll be talking about wargaming here at the Naval War College. On 11 March, we'll talk about space and national security. 18 March is my favorite. 50 years ago, on the 17th of March, Johnny Cash was on the stage at Spruance Auditorium and did a 2-hour concert. Well, we're going to replicate that concert. We've hired somebody that looks like him, sounds like him. We've got recorded music from that event. The recording was made by a young 10-year-old girl related to Johnny Cash. In 1987, she became Miss America. And so we're lucky to have her recording available to us. So we're going to do that a little later. We're going to do that from 1900 to 2030 in what we call a contemporary civilization lecture. So again, it'll be available in person in Spruance Auditorium and via Zoom. Moving ahead, on April 22nd, we will have Russian mercenaries as the topic. April 29th, war fighters and strategic empathy, interesting concept. On 13 May, Porter Halliburton, who was a POW for eight years in Vietnam, will be speaking about his experience. We bring him back every year so he can talk about how he survived that 8 years in the various prisons in Vietnam. And that'll be done in the morning between 10:30 and 12, again, connected with the resident program, but again, you're welcome to participate. And on the 27th of May, Professor John Maurer will be talking about Churchill and America. So a lot of interesting and exciting things. We encourage you to participate in as many as you can. Okay, on with the main event. At the conclusion of the presentation, we'll take some questions. We do not have microphones in this auditorium for the seats, but if you'll speak loudly, Dr. Paine will repeat the question for the folks who are watching us remotely, and we'll answer it for you. So, the lecture, Geopolitics, Lessons from the Last Cold War and the Way Forward, we'll start with the geopolitical cards dealt to the United States, Russia, and China. While the United States and its partners, our allies, are attempting to maintain a maritime global order to foster trade, China and Russia are great continental powers increasingly fixated on dominating territory. These differences have precipitated a second Cold War. The second section will examine the views of those on both sides who oversaw the end of the last Cold War, and will try to explain how democracies won that without fighting a hot war. And the final session will suggest some possible ways that forward, based on geopolitical hand that the United States hold, the potential strategies that such hand can support, and the strategies that proved most fruitful the last time around. Our lecturer, Sarah C.M. Paine, the college's William S. Sims University Professor of History and Grand Strategy, has published Wars for Asia, 1911 to 1949, Japanese Empire with Bruce Ellerman, Modern China, Continuity and Change, 1644 to the Present, and 5 co-edited books on naval operations. The Economist just featured her in its annual special issue, The World Ahead 2025. I'm pleased to pass the microphone to one of the college's most well-known speakers, Dr. Sally Paine.
Stairs, we can share.
I'll assist you.
You'll assist me, yeah, I've got to be that age. Okay, thank you. Okay, I got all my goodies on the technology. It's such a pleasure to be here with you all. Thank you for coming. And here's my game plan. We got the current problem now, which is a second Cold War. And my reckoning is it began between 2012 and 14. Why those dates? 2012 is when Vlad the Bad comes to power. Actually, he disposes term limits that year. And then you get Xi Jinping coming into power. And then 2014 is when Vlad the Bad moves into Ukraine. And ever since, Putin and Xi have been emphasizing that they're not particularly interested in this rules-based order and have other plans for us. So I've got a 3-part lecture, but really it's 2 main parts. The first part is the underlying geopolitics, and the second part is how the last Cold War was won, lost, and played. And then at the end, I'll say, based on all this, what is the way forward? And that'll be short. If I go at a real rate, I'll get this done in an hour and 5. So here we go. First half. It turns out that continental and maritime empires ran business in fundamentally different ways, how they wanted to organize themselves and how they wanted to organize others. But then the Industrial Revolution came and put both of them out of business and introduced a incoming maritime rules-based order. So that's what I'm going to talk about, 3 parts, first half. For those of you who like animals, and we at the Naval War College, generally speaking, most of us like animals. So the maritime powers are the whales, the elephants are the continental powers. All right, so the first distinguishing characteristic of maritime versus continental powers is whether you can or cannot defend primarily at sea. Look at Ukraine. They cannot defend primarily at sea. So if you can, having a big navy would be a thing for you. And if you can only defend by land, then you need to go to army. And these differences have profound not only military, but also economic and political ramifications, and I'll go into them. The United States started out as a typical continental power. Here's President Monroe, the Monroe Doctrine. Typical continental power, spheres of influence, telling the Europeans, stay out of the Americas, it's ours. And here's how the United States expanded, again, like a typical continental power. It did a series of regional wars with Mexico, the longest counterinsurgency in U.S. history, fought against the Native Americans. But the twist that Americans liked was checkbook diplomacy, paying money to people, and that's what the Louisiana Purchase and buying Alaska were all about. And Americans had a name for this, and it was manifest destiny. It was the obvious manifest fate of America, the United States. We appropriated the name for the entire continent to own at least North America. And this painting, which today goes by the politically correct name of a Westward Ho, at the time of painting was called Westward the Course of Empire Takes Its Way. It hangs in the Capitol. Apparently it's some part of the House of Representatives. So Americans in the 19th century considered themselves an empire, proud of it. But the view changes in the late 19th century. And here, Alfred Thayer Mahan, who is by far the most famous person ever associated with this college, of enduring international influence, he looks at the world and thinks, well, actually, it's not so much continental consolidation that is the origin of power and position in this world, but the wealth accruing from maritime trade. And he said there are 6 prerequisites for playing this game of maritime security paradigm. Number 1, you need a moat. You need insulation from attack. Number 2, you need a dense internal transportation grid to get the goods out in peacetime. You need reliable egress by sea to get the Navy out in wartime. You need dense coastal population. These are the people running this commerce-driven economy. And you need the commerce-driven economy that goes with them. And you also need stable government institutions. Because this is going to mean you have stable laws that promote commerce and also promote the Navy. If you look at China and Russia today, neither one of them has the full list of 6. Start with moat. They most certainly do not have moats, either one of them. In fact, they each have more neighbors than any other 2 countries on the planet. And a lot of those places don't much like them for excellent reasons. Moreover, China has an improving internal transportation grid, but Russia's remains lamentable. Neither one has reliable access by sea because they're all surrounded by narrow, island-cluttered coastal seas that are surrounded by all kinds of neighbors that shut down in wartime. And I guess Russia's got the big Arctic thing. Well, great. If you want to go cavort with polar bears, that's a place for you, but not for commerce. In addition, China has a dense coastal population. Russia doesn't. I mentioned the polar bears. Russia has never had a commerce-driven economy. And under Deng Xiaoping, China was more so. But in recent years, Xi Jinping has been privileging the crony sector over the private sector. And neither China nor Russia has stable government institutions. And what would be the defining characteristic of that? Well, regular, transparent transfers of executive power. And dictator for life does not remotely qualify. So China and Russia have some maritime ambitions, but they don't have the geopolitical position actually to play the game. And I'm not even clear they understand it. Here, if you look at China, it shows you a lot of vertical real estate there. And the flat stuff up north, a lot of it, not all of it, is either awfully cold or awfully dry to grow much of anything. So if you look where the Han live, the preponderant ethnic group of China, it's all the pink places. You can see where they live, and then they're surrounded by heterogeneous ethnic groups. And then if it's a simplified ethnic map, what you realize is that the Han occupy all the prime real estate, and the curious might ask, how did that happen? And the answer would be they laid waste to the competing Dzungar and Mongol empires. Bet you haven't heard about the Dzungars. The Qing dynasty wiped them out hundreds of years ago. And this is how continental empires run business. Either you get with the program or they will kill you, right? It's a binary choice. Either you become Han, honorary Han, or that's it. And in our own day, I believe the Uyghurs are slated for genocide. This is not a world for the faint-hearted. All right, now for a sanitized version of Chinese history. The Han started out up there. On the Yellow River Valley, and then they spread and they spread and they spread. Built some walls too and spread and did all this crazy stuff, and they're coming and going and going and coming. And then there's a lot of consolidation before this happens to them. This is the Yuan dynasty. It looks like just bigger version of what I've been showing you, except there's a major discontinuity. These Yuan dynasty, they're Mongols. This is the largest empire in Chinese history, and when the Han are a subjugated people, and this grossly understates the issue. The Mongol Empire went all the way west to Hungary, and they're expanding over the Eurasian plain. But the Han reassert themselves under the Ming. The Mongols only last for a century. But then the Ming succumb to the second largest empire in Chinese history. This is the Qing. They aren't Han either. They're Manchus. And so what's quite ironic today, when the Chinese government starts claiming what its historic lands are, they go back to the Mongol Yuan dynasty or the Manchu Qing dynasty, when quite ironically the Han were subjugated people. But the reason for all the maps wasn't to make that snide remark, but rather it was to show you lots and lots of shrinkage, lots and lots of expansion, and lots of bloodshed while this is taking place. The Chinese have been raising an army and arming armies denominated in hundreds of thousands of people for thousands of years. The West does not do this, certainly not on a regular basis. until the Napoleonic Wars. So it's quite a world, this continental world. And just to let you know how Russia did it, the Russians, their expansion from the Grand Duchy or whatever it was of Muscovy is like Mongols in reverse. They're going from west to east across the Eurasian plain. All right. If you look at Russia's no-kidding enemies circa 1900, there are lots of them. Because although in this world of empire you're leveraging internal lines of communication, it comes with a corresponding disadvantage of multiple neighbors. And so these are Russia's, no kidding, security threats. It's very different from the security world of Britain with its 360-degree you can't get me vote. Lots of people have come to get Russians over the years, the Swedes, the Mongols, the French, the Germans, and most recently in the Cold War, the West. But each time the central position allowed them to rise again. And here, in this sort of world, power is a function of land. Neighbors are dangerous. Even the itty-bitty ones can cause problems because the instability can spread over the border. And the big ones, if they've got an attitude, are dangerous because they may come get you. So the purpose for an army in this world is not the maritime power army, which is expeditionary warfare. The expedition means you cross the ocean to go somewhere else. In this world, the army's number one mission is to keep the ruling regime in power. So if you think People's Liberation Army, you think it's the Praetorian Guard of the Chinese Communist Party. The second most important thing for your army is to prevent any defections from the empire. And then only third is it border defense. So in this world, away games are rare. Most of the fighting is on home territory, and the winner takes and keeps the field. Now, this is going to give you some of the mathematics of all this, of the costs of the home front, main front. So these are deaths in World War II, a lot of Axis deaths, military deaths, and then a lot of Allied land power deaths, high numbers. But when you compare Britain and France, Britain and the United States, the two maritime powers, with France and Italy, by some statistics, they suffer less. And France wasn't even in the war that long. And then if you add in civilian deaths, the difference between the maritime deaths and the continental deaths just skyrocket. And why is this? Because in the continental world, a lot of the fighting happens on home territory, particularly if you lose. So your citizens have no sanctuary from this, and there are a lot of deaths associated with it. No country in their right mind wants to fight on the home front, main front. It's just so costly. Continental powers just don't have a choice. Maritime powers, it's a great point of strategy of whether, and if you do, when you're going to get involved. But there are certain advantages if you win on the main front, home front. Because, for instance, Stalin, he wins World War II, wherever his Red Army is. He keeps Eastern Europe, but it comes at the cost of millions and millions of Soviet deaths to do this. And there are certain rules to play and win in this particular setup. Rule number one, neighbors are numerous, so no two-front wars. If multiple neighbors try to come get you, you're in trouble. Secondly, no great power neighbors. Why? Because today's friend can be tomorrow's foe, and that will spell trouble. So what do? You take on your neighbors sequentially. You set them to fail. You destabilize the rising, ingest the failing, set up buffer zone in between, and you wait the opportune moment to pounce and absorb. That is Vladimir Putin's game. Better yet, you get the neighbors to do the work for you. You sow their mutual resentments by deluging them with fake news and anything else you can think of, so that Russia can play the role of a jackal state to steal the kill made by others. Well, if this is your security paradigm, you're going to surround yourself with failing states. Look at Russia and China. They have some of the most dysfunctional places on the planet on their borders. Are they unlucky, or are they complicit? Also, there are no enduring alliances because people figure it out. Eventually, the hegemonic power only offers trouble in the long run. And there's also a tendency for overextension. Like there's no counsel on how much is enough, territory is enough before you choke on it. But before you dismiss this security paradigm, understand this is how the great civilizations of Eurasia ran business. They didn't care about collateral damage, killing a bunch of extra people. This paradigm is all about wrecking things, killing people to get territory. And you've seen it operating in real time in Syria and in Ukraine. All right, here's the problem for the likes of Vladimir Putin. In this world, if you botch strategy, your known world can just vanish forever. And this is what happened to Imperial Russia, Imperial China, and many of these great civilizations of Eurasia. And I love this picture of an aristocrat's ruined palace or whatever it is in Russia, because those whole social classes were wiped off the face of the map by the Bolsheviks for messing with their strategy. So the continental world is a world without insurance policies. Here's the maritime world. It's different. I love this picture. I don't know how accurate it is, but it shows all of the commerce that's going on in the 19th century, and shows the Atlantic, a very busy place, the center of the world economy. And all of these sea lines of communication are connecting trade from all the coastlines. They're traversing the ocean, which is a commons, a shared space. Think about it, in our own highly networked age, the seas are the world's original network, potentially connecting everyone with everything. And this maritime world begins, or it goes back further, but certainly it's up and starting with the ancient Greeks, who have this rimland empire along the Aegean and Ionian seas, where they're making a lot of money from trade. Roman Empire, similar idea. A rimland empire, very different from the consolidated empires of Russia and China. And look at the terminology: Mediterranean, Middle-Terranean lands. It's the sea among the lands. Whereas the name for China is Zhongguo, Zhong, central, Guo, kingdom, the kingdom among the kingdoms. One piece of vocabulary emphasizes the centrality of the sea, the other the centrality of the land. Now, the Silk Road connected these two worlds, East and West, and there has been much money to be made on East-West trade for a very long time, and whoever controlled the western terminus there, a big toll booth, made a lot of money. For a while, the Muslim conquest settled that problem, but then for a while, no one controlled the rimlands, and this is when the Crusades take place, which is in part of who's going to control the toll booth. For a long time, the Ottomans settled that problem. They controlled it. And therefore, the Spanish and the Portuguese got creative. They decided to get to Asia the long way around, except they bumped into the New World, new to them, not so much to other people, bumped into gold and silver, and decided to forget about the high-end dinnerware. They're going to do heavy metal instead. So the Dutch are the real people who focus on an empire that's all about trade and their trading bases. Their problem was their exposed position in Europe, so that they could be defeated in Europe. So the real pioneers of maritime empire are the British. So whereas every other country in Europe had to maintain a large, potentially coup-generating standing army that's expensive, and that also is probably going to want to have economic policies privilege the army, Britain could take its disadvantage, its dependence on trade, and transform it into an advantage. That if they could make lots and lots of money on trade, that would fund a navy. If anyone tries to invade, you drown it at sea. So you've got homeland defense. And meanwhile, while your adversaries are busy destroying wealth at a really rapid clip, Britain is going to maximize its money. So this is a prevent-defeat strategy. No one's going to invade Britain if they keep a good navy. But it doesn't deliver victory against continental problems. So a navy won't do that for you. Here's the guy on the horse who's with the attitude who got the British thinking really deeply about grand strategy. In fact, Britons coined the term. A grand strategy is grand in the multiplicity of instruments of national power that are integrated, because if Britain's going to rely on a navy, navies rarely can deliver victory in a war. Usually you need other things to go on as well, so they're going to be thinking grand strategy. And so after much trial and much error, 6 coalitions, final capstone alliance, they deal with Napoleon. And here is their grand strategy for elephant hunting that they actually used to great effect in World War II as well. First of all, keep the home economy growing. That's where your money is. That's going to fund your military. It's going to fund your allies. That's key. Second, don't let the enemy elephant forage. You want to shut them right down and force them back for resources on their own dwindling resources and their increasingly embittered allies. And then you want to rent an elephant. You want to find the continental power most directly threatened by your continental problem, and you want to arm and fund that country that is fighting on the main front. And then Britain needs to find a theater peripheral to that main theater that favors maritime access. And if it can find a good theater to do that, it is going to have cumulative effects on the enemy. More people are getting killed in the enemy. Secondly, you're going to force the enemy to fight on divided attentions, because there are a couple theaters going on here, and you're going to relieve pressure on the main front, you hope. And Britain, if it chooses the right theater, its casualties will be far lower than the continental problem it's dealing with. Rule number 5 is don't take on the, certainly not as your opening move, don't go toe-to-toe with your continental problem. Because Britain's great strength is not its army. The great strength of a continental power is its army. Britain needs to leverage its ability to generate money and help other people and leverage those things. And if Britain is going to get involved on the main front, only do it after you've really bled that elephant. And you come in with lots of friends, always gang up on others if you can in this world. As much as a continental power might want to do this, can't. Why? Because it probably has very constrained maritime access, can't deploy a navy easily. And secondly, has a surfeit of neighbors who might cause problems. But if Britain plays this game, it can put itself and its enemies on opposing trend lines. So Britain is going to get wealthier and wealthier and wealthier if it can trade. And meanwhile, this war is encroaching on your enemy, so it's going to it's going to encroach on enemy territory, undermine the economy, morale, productivity, etc. So eventually, what the story is, they're going to get exhausted first. It's a strategy of exhaustion. And it focuses not only on military power, but also economics, coalitions, institution building, and there's certain prerequisites. One is sanctuary at home. No one can touch your productive base for this really to work well. You need access to markets, access to allies, access to peripheral theaters, and you need institutional stability at home to run a long-term foreign policy. These are some of the things that Mahan would later emphasize. All right, this brings me to the second distinguishing characteristic between maritime and continental powers. Continental powers face contiguous threats. So they got to pay attention to them, focus on national security. And as a result, they tend to want to be insulated from their neighbors and have exclusion zones that they tend to also want to apply to the seas, exclude people from near seas. Maritime powers, because of their comparative security of a moat, are all about trying to make money by doing international trade. And so they want access to international markets, and therefore they want the seas to be a commons that everyone can share. So the second distinguishing characteristic is a focus on insulation from landward neighbors versus access to markets, and therefore a desire for closed or open seas. We're starting to get to two very different world orders here. All right. That's it for empires. The Industrial Revolution upended both types of empires because it introduces economic growth, whose compounding effects were truly revolutionary. The Industrial Revolution starts in Britain, and after the Napoleonic Wars settle down, it moves to the continent. It's been making its disruptive path around the world ever since. And you can see it's based on a combination of institutional and technological factors. What it does is it changes the currency of international power. Formerly, power was a function of land, right? That's where you get your commodities that you can buy and sell. That's where you get your peasant conscripts to man mass armies. Well, once you have compounding growth, the source of power in this world's money that's going to come from trade, industry, and commerce. And it is the most disruptive effect for traditional societies the globe over. Suddenly, their security paradigms don't work anymore. I mean, look at who's rich and who's poor in the world today. It's degrees of industrialization going on. And ever since the Industrial Revolution, there's been a gradual expansion with ups and downs of this maritime trading order, which is all about negotiating often quite acrimoniously, but negotiating rules for trade. But it's a catastrophic event for traditional societies, many of which have never gotten over it. The Chinese never liked the incoming maritime order in the 19th century, and they aren't happy about it now. This guy, Malcolm McLean, really sets things moving on the expansion of the maritime order. He ran a trucking company, and he took his trucks, minus the chassis, and put them on ships, what we call containers, and this radically reduced shipping times, loading times, so it becomes so much cheaper to send things by sea than by land. And then these container sizes are standardized to go 1 if by truck, 2 if by rail car, and thousands if by sea. So I guess we got the last dictator, or the latest dictator for life, Xi Jinping, who thinks he's got this choo-choo train event with the Belt Road Initiative, that somehow this is the great way to get goods around the world. Okay, here's my argument why his math is flawed. In 1960, the average tanker size was 20,000 deadweight tons. In our own day, the smallest ultra-large crude tanker is 250,000 deadweight tons. This means, well, the largest container ships now, and I probably should update the stats, it's probably even larger, is about 21,000 containers, over $1 billion in cargo, one ship. Whereas you're going to do a train, 600 containers, give me a break on what's going to cost money. Also, for the Belt Road thing to work, it's got to be continuous from end to end. And it would be nice if it were all the same track gauge, or otherwise you're loading, unloading. And it would be really nice if the track were continuous. Well, it's not. Also, in peacetime, things will move, but in wartime, Xi Jinping is going to even have trouble with the maritime part of his Belt Road initiative because China is surrounded by narrow, island-cluttered seas with lots of neighbors who may or may not like them. In wartime, those seas are closed to commercial traffic. You can't get it through, and you even have trouble getting warships through. So, whereas the West, that's going through the high seas, provided you convoy things, you can get stuff through. So his Belt Road thing has problems. Anyway, if you look at the inter-Cold War period, or even at the end of World War II, you look at this skyrocketing international trade that lifts hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. And in the inter-Cold War period, from the 90s upwards, look at it, it just goes up, up, and away. And this is the miracle of our times. But I'm sad to tell you it's over. The inter-Cold War period is over. There's going to be this funding and counterfunding of insurgencies the globe over, which is going to be incredibly wealth reducing. All right, so this transportation revolution that just makes it so much cheaper to ship things by ship is going to lead me into my third distinguishing characteristic between maritime and continental powers. Continental powers in the past did quite well with their interior lines of communication, right? It's to garrison their empire, to deploy their armies against people causing them problems. And also it allowed them to form alliances with contiguous places. Whereas the maritime powers are using these exterior lines of communication. That's what oceans are. They're exterior lines of communication. But it's providing access to global markets, access to wartime allies. And guess what? This one gives you the possibility of a global alliance system. The other doesn't. So this third deciding characteristic, reliance on interior versus exterior lines of communication, and whether you can have a contiguous or global alliance system. These two sets of preferences are two mutually exclusive world orders. The Industrial Revolution upended the world not only because of the cheaper transportation, but because it offered the possibility of a new positive sum world order. Instead of wrecking all your neighbors, which is what the continental paradigm is, right? You're destabilizing neighbors, you're invading, and you're just destroying things. So great, you get territory, but it's just a wasteland, whatever you get. Instead, the maritime order is positive sum, right? The continental order is negative sum. Why? Because the loser's loss is less than the winner's win, because you're capturing damaged goods. But in this world, it's all about positive sum trade transactions where both parties win. That's why you do the trade. And in this world, there's a focus for it to work on freedom of navigation, free trade, international laws and institutions facilitating the trade to minimize the transaction costs. And the insurance system for all of this are alliances, so that countries that aren't maritime by geography, if they join up with enough other people, they can all come out in force with various instruments of national power to deal with the continental problems that are going on. And here is the insurance system for all of this, created by the greatest generation, the World War I generation, not the World War II who claimed it. World War I generation who were conscripts when they were young, trying to raise families during the Great Depression, and then they're the strategic leaders of World War II. They decided that, and they'd send their kids to fight World War II. They decided that the solution to World War and Great Depressions was institution building on a global scale. And they're the ones who really rapidly build. They get the UN going, the IMF, NATO. You're going to get the predecessor institutions of the EU and World Trade Organization to hold the peace institutionally. And it did in the industrialized world until Vlad the Bad worked his magic and Ukraine decided to overturn the chess table. All right, the maritime world is invisible. And here's why. It took me working here 15 years for it to dawn on me what was going on. It has to do with the difference between negative and positive objectives. The continental world's all about positive objectives. You're taking land, and when you take it, or even when you're trying to take it, you're wrecking things so people can see what's going on. The maritime world, particularly if you're successful, is about negative objectives. You're preventing stuff from happening. So in this continental world, operationally, you can have all these wins, but actually you're destroying wealth at the strategic level at a rapid clip. Whereas in the maritime world, so what are you preventing, particularly if you're the Navy? The Navy focuses mostly on negative objectives in peacetime. Not always, but mostly. And peacetime, by the way, is most of the time, or it has been of late. The Navy is preventing the destruction of the global trading system. That would be an important mission. Preventing limits on freedom of navigation. If you can't get goods port to port, pretty useless. So that would be important. Also, navies are about deterring people from trying to take other people's territory. Sovereignty being the bedrock principle of international law. So these are incredibly important objectives. But on a good day, Navy day, absolutely nothing happens. Looks like the Navy's doing nothing, but it's incredibly important. And so maritime powers, the way they hold it together with alliances, diplomacy, sanctions, embargoes, containment, all kinds of things going on, the Navy's deterrence, blockades, commerce rating. And you can look at the sanctions and things and go, well, the rogue's still there. True. But if you shave 1 or 2% growth off your rogue, wait a few generations, and it's the difference between North and South Korea. So you're shrinking the opposing piggy bank. And you go, well, I'd like to solve the whole problem. Well, great. If the whole problem has nuclear weapons, the solution may be Armageddon. And this world is not about operational wins. It's about the strategic win of maximizing wealth for you and your allies. All right. There were optimists at the end of the Cold War who thought that surely this maritime continental thing was over and that everyone would go for liberal democracy. Not so. Here we got Mr. Fit and Misfit, Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, who want to hollow out our alliance systems. They want to undermine international law. They want to wreck international institutions to subject all of us to the kind of squalor their own citizens have to endure. All right, to summarize this half, there are 3 characteristics that distinguish continental and maritime powers. The ability to defend primarily at sea, focus on insulation from versus access to the world, reliance on interior versus exterior lines of communication. And from these accidents of geography come some preferences. A continental preference, looking at territory, thinking about taking it. A maritime, looking at it and thinking, it's markets. Continental thought about prioritizing self-sufficiency, whereas maritime is power interested in access. Continental power, exclusive zones. Maritime power about commons, not only maritime commons, but air, cyber, space commons. And obviously, a lot of countries aren't strictly one or the other, so there's a corollary to all of this. You can gain a maritime position by the countries you support and the international institutions that you support, so that collectively the whole thing can operate on a maritime security paradigm. And the choice is quite consequential, because those who choose a continental paradigm these days typically are dictators who wind up hemorrhaging their cash, either to dominate their own systems, their own citizens, or their neighbors. If you think about China, by rejoining the maritime system under Deng Xiaoping, it was amazing, transforming a very poor country to a far richer country. But these older continental predilections still exist, and they seem to be taking a U-turn on this road. Sadly, the continental world, it's negative sum. The only positive sum that human beings have come up with is this maritime order. For all of its flaws, at least there are institutions where you can go to and send your lawyers and diplomats and argue things out that way. The alternative is potentially terminal for mankind if you get into a big war. Okay, that's first half. Second half, Cold War. There was one that turned out quite well. Is there anything we can glean from this? How did it turn out the way it did? A lot of people derive comfort and they say Ronald Reagan won the Cold War. That's one way of looking at it. I'm going to have a lot of arguments and counter-arguments because there are many explanations. But this one's a good one to start with. Those who support it, although this picture seems remarkably cordial at the Reagan Ranch after it's all over, and the Gorbachev seemed perfectly happy. But what happened, Ronald Reagan did a big military buildup. And the Russians, at the end of the Cold War, some have estimated that as much as 70% of their economy was devoted to the military. And it was absolutely suffocating. And if you think about the Germans, the Nazis in hot war, they only spent 55% of their economy on this stuff. And so it was a problem for the Soviets. I'm going to be quoting a lot of Russians today because they thought deeply about what happened to their country. How they lost the Soviet Union, the empire, and indeed the world as they knew it. Here is Valentin Fallon. He was a long-time serving Soviet ambassador to Germany. And he said, look, the American strategy of our exhaustion in the arms race, it just wrecked our quality of life. And also, Russia had an arms race not only with the United States, but also problems with China. So the arms race plunged the Soviet economy into a permanent crisis. And here's Georgy Arbatov, who was the Soviet prime expert on the United States, who's watching Reagan funding anti-communist counterinsurgencies all over the world. This is how you destroy wealth, by having both sides funding insurgencies. And in Afghanistan, he goes, yeah, we got our Vietnam. Problem for us. So some would argue that U.S. victory in the arms race, that determined the victory in the Cold War. Okay, I'm going to go through other presidents, and because there are other arguments, starting with Ford, Carter, and the Helsinki Accords. For the longest time after World War II, the Soviets really wanted to hold a European-wide conference for everyone to agree on their expanded World War II borders. And for the longest time, the Europeans weren't interested. But then by the 70s, they're sick of all the drama. The United States isn't interested, but we show up. And then we say, we're going to have some human rights clauses in here, which we know they aren't going to respect. And lo and behold, this is the third basket of the human rights clauses of the Helsinki Accords. Lo and behold, human rights activists in the West and dissidents throughout the Warsaw Pact started trying to hold the Soviet government accountable, saying, okay, where is the liberation that communism has promised? Why are we dealing with this dictatorship that's been delivered? And by the way, you signed all of these things. And this dissident movement, human rights movement, took on a life of its own. And here's Jimmy Carter, who then ran with it. And he's giving a commencement address at Notre Dame. He said, look, we have reaffirmed America's commitment to human rights as a fundamental tenet of our foreign policy. What draws us together is a belief in human freedom. We want the world to know that our nation stands for more than just financial prosperity. We're bigger than that. Carter was emphasizing precisely the political freedoms that were being denied throughout the Eastern Bloc. And here is Oleg Ganevsky, a longtime Soviet career diplomat, saying, look, the communist ideology is associated above all with the Soviet Union. And when you reject it, a vacuum, a real problem. So that some would argue that the human rights causes of the Helsinki Accords and Carter's subsequent human rights campaign destroyed communist belief in communism. And that's why it all ended. Okay, another president, another explanation. Others say, nonsense, it's Richard Nixon on the China card. And others would say, no, it's Mao and the America card, but whatever. It turns out that in 1969, Russia and China were going at it in a border war and over some islands in the Amur River. And the Russians approached the United States and said, would it be okay if we nuke these people? And the United States said, no way, okay. And Mao figured it out. The one that wants to nuke you is the primary adversary. And this reshuffles the great powers. Prior to this, China, the United States had been the primary adversary of China and Russia. After this is over, China and Russia are each other's primary adversaries. And the United States decides, since it's a swing vote, let's go gang up with China against Russia. And this forces Russia into a bankrupting militarization of its long frontier with China. It's already militarized its European frontier, but now it's got to put these mechanized nuclear armed forces there. Imagine if the United States had to do this on our long Canadian and Mexican borders. It would be bankrupting, and our economy is much larger than the Russian economy. So, great. The slides have just disappeared. Do we have anyone working on fixing the, So, thank you very much. I don't know what I did. I work magic on these things. Anyway, the appliances, I wreck them. All right, some would argue that the U.S. cooperation with China fatally overextended the Soviet Union. But another way is to put together all of these presidents to say each one offered open opportunities for successors. So Nixon plays the China card, which then Ford keeps using and then starts playing the human rights card. Carter runs with that, begins a military buildup that Reagan really runs with. And this puts Reagan and Bush later operating from a position of military and ideological strength. So also for those who think that U.S. foreign policy wasn't consistent during the Cold War, you have it wrong. The policy objective was relentless: free trade, democracy, containment of communism. The two political parties, Republicans and Democrats, agreed on this. They had different strategies how to achieve it, but they agreed on that. All right, so someone would argue that Presidents Nixon through Reagan produced the cumulative presidential effects to defeat the Soviet Union. Others would say, forget this great man theory of history business. It's this platform, the nuclear-powered, nuclear-armed submarine that determined the outcome of the Cold War. Because under Carter, and then certainly under Reagan, there was a much more aggressive strategy of targeting Soviet nuclear subs in their home water bastions, and the Soviets were scared to death that they didn't have a reliable second strike capability. And so here you have Marshal Akhrameyev, who is in the United States, telling his hosts, we're surrounded. That's why we're concerned. We know that you know where our subs are, and we don't know where yours are. You, the United States Navy, are the problem. We'll go Navy. So the USSR could not counter technologically or financially the U.S. submarine threat and to its retaliatory nuclear forces. So some would argue this is why they had to settle in the Cold War. All right, so all the preceding explanations I've been giving you are naval explanations spelled with an E, as in staring at one's own. They're all about what Team America did or didn't do. So let's get to the other side of the tennis court net to see what Team Russia was up to. And here's Arnold Toynbee. He was one of the finest historians of the 20th century, observing that civilizations die from suicide, not by murder. So I've been talking about the murder, right? What other countries did to the Soviet Union. Now I'm going to get to the suicide, the self-defeating things that the Soviets did. So explanation number one, from looking at the other side of the tennis court net, is to say they lost the Cold War because their empire collapsed. That domino theory idea that was supposed to apply to capitalism, actually it applied to communism, because once the democratic contagion hit one Warsaw Pact country and demonstrations for freedom started coming with increasing frequency, they spread to the other Warsaw Pact countries. And the leaders of these countries no longer had the stomach for the kind of violence it would take to get the demonstrators off the street. So Gorbachev's ideas of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, rebuilding, they resonated throughout Russia and Eastern Europe. Russians hit the streets demonstrating for political freedoms, and in Eastern Europe, they hit the streets demonstrating for freedom from the Soviet Union, and the Soviets may not have gotten that distinction. But Gorbachev was all about encouraging people to reform, and so he didn't send tanks into the Eastern Bloc. He said, you need to do political and economic reforms the way we are. And these reforms started in Poland. Poland had quite a history that goes back with it. It's been suffering severe unrest periodically, 58, on and off, and then a big time in 1980-81. This is when Solidarity, the workers' movement, gains a national and an international reputation. It is the only independent opposition movement of any Warsaw Pact country. And then in 1988, it gets really bad because the economy is a mess. The government needs to raise staple prices because the budget's broke. And Solidarity hits the streets, and the government is afraid of the economy going to free fall. So they offer Solidarity a place at the bargaining table if they'll call off the strikes. And a complicating factor in Poland is the Roman Catholic Church, an institution of enormous legitimacy, and which had a partiality for Solidarity. Okay, so these talks started taking place in February 1989, the roundtable talks. And here's Soviet advice to the Poles. You got to find some quick solutions. You're an itty-bitty country, so if you make mistakes, they'll be itty-bitty mistakes. But if we make them, they'll be big. They got that one right. The Communist Party in Poland decides to hold elections. And those elections were held on the very same day that Deng Xiaoping calls out the tanks and you have the Tiananmen massacre. Two very different solutions. And the Communist Party thought in Poland that they had it under control. Why? Because they thought they had these party-designated seats that would make sure they controlled everything. So, not so much. What happens is Solidarity wins every seat but one for which it could compete, and in the party-designated seats, the party only gets 3. And who gets all the rest of them? The box on the ballot called none of the above. That's the end of Communist Party legitimacy in Poland, and then further democratic reforms are on the way. The demonstrations cascade into East Germany, which in the past had always sent out tanks. Well, would-be tank man Erich Honecker was already out of a job because his disastrous strategy of living off debt since when he came in power, I think it's 71 or something, had just wrecked the place. So he had been forced out. Most of the Politburos resigned. By the time you get to November 9th, they issue some new travel rules. Why do we care about travel? Here's why we care about travel. And what's left of the government, this Gunter Schabowski is at a press conference and he's being asked, well, what are the travel regulations going to be implemented? And so instead of admitting he didn't know, he winged it and he said, immediately. Well, immediately, huge crowds started massing at the 6 gates of East Berlin. And at one of them, the border guards decided that discretion is the better part of valor. They opened it. And people just streamed into West Berlin. And within a week, over half the country had visited West Berlin. And it was a pivotal choice, a pivotal event. And like the Polish elections, opening the gate, there's no going back to the way the world was. It's over. So Gunter missed that one. All right, and here is Anatoly Kovalyov's take on it. He was a longtime deputy foreign minister in the Soviet Union. So you can look, and there was no confidence whatsoever. The Soviets had no confidence whatsoever whom the East German army is going to shoot, us or the demonstrators. Same thing for the Poles and the Hungarians. Great, with an alliance system like this, you got troubles. So unrest in the empire forced the Soviet Union to forfeit the Cold War. All right, here's another way of looking at it. Another counter-argument for me said, no, it's something different. It has to do with the satellites themselves are terribly unhealthy, and that's the origin of the problem. So if you look at this map, circa 1960, all those tempting green places, they're about to become independent. They're really sick of their colonial overlords. Enter Soviet Union with a plan to put them out of business. And there were many takers. Fast forward to 1980-ish. And you can see all the promising pink places where the Soviets have got all kinds of new friends. Well, here's the problem. In the late 70s, commodity prices, including oil, go way down. And these places depend on that. The Soviet Union, for some years, as much of its government budget as 55% was based on oil. So not only did the non-performing pals have no money and need bigger subsidies, but the Soviet Union was less in a position to subsidize them with its deep bench of these places. And most problematically at all, Soviet Union's own internal nationalities simultaneously erupt, and they all want to secede. Remember the rule of Continental Empire, no 2 front wars? Well, the Soviets had so many fronts at this point they couldn't keep track of it. So you can make an argument that by bankrupting itself in the Third World, ignoring its own internal Third World, that's why the Soviet Union lost the Cold War. Another argument, economics. You could say that the Soviet economy lost the Cold War. Here are the statistics. Economy did quite well rebuilding after World War II, but it really stagnates in the 70s. And so in the decade preceding when Gorbachev comes into power, the Soviet economy has been growing from 1% to 2% less per annum compared to the West. And the compounding effects are really very large. And then here's what's going on. If you have a command economy, you have Moscow Central telling everybody what resources they get, what they're going to produce. But when you're a unit on the bottom, what you have to do is you lie about what inventory you have. You say it's less than it is. And then you lie about how many inputs you need. You say it's more than you need because you have no idea what you're actually going to get. And everyone's lying to each other, so the macroeconomic statistics are garbage. So people are allocating capital and labor without really knowing what their true values are. No one has any idea of consumer preferences or what productivity is. So the misallocation is horrendous, and no one figures it out until it's catastrophic. And so under Gorbachev, oil prices have tanked. This mess is starting to deliver troubles. And economic growth goes negative. It's a mess. So here's Marshal Yazov looking at all this and go, look, NATO, they're just rich. We can't counter these people. We've got to figure out some way of calling it off. So the Soviet economy lost the Cold War. Here is a very famous man, Alexis de Tocqueville, and a very famous quotation from him. He wrote a very famous book about the last years of the monarchy before it fell in the French Revolution. And he has this chestnut in there. The most dangerous moment for a bad government is when it begins to reform. And people in Russia disagree about many things, but they agree at least on this one point, that Gorbachev's role was absolutely central in how it all turned out. And Gorbachev made his decisions based on a number of incorrect assumptions. First, that history was irreversible. It's always forward towards communism. And of course, Eastern Europe made a U-turn back to capitalism. And also here his foreign policy advisor, Anatoly Chernayev's, Gorbachev misread the sentiments of the neighbors. Gorbachev thought that the Eastern Europeans would look upon him as their liberator, rather than looking upon Russia as their usurper. And here's Chernayev. Gorbachev thought that bringing freedom to our Eastern European satellites, that's already a bad word, who wants to be a satellite, would lead them to adopt socialism with a human face. Whatever that is. He made an enormous mistake because these countries brutally turned their back on us. It was totally unexpected for us. Really? You invade the neighbors, you kill their leaders, you siphon off their wealth, you impose a non-performing economic model on them, and then you never leave and you wonder why these people don't like you? Give me a break. The United States intervenes in civil wars all over the world, but we deluge them with economic aid, and we even leave. People don't like us. I don't know why the Russians think they're so special. All right. In addition, Gorbachev believed if there was no Warsaw Pact, there would be no NATO, that NATO would disappear, and that if there were no Comecon, that's their internal trading or group, that then there would be no European community or the EU today. Wrong. Two of those things are still around. He also thought that the United States would be like a continental power. No great powers don't want them, and would oppose German unification. So Gorbachev goes on vacation while all the unrest is happening in Germany, poor life choice, because what's actually going on is President Bush and Chancellor Kohl of Germany are coordinating on the fastest reunification of Germany ever. So some would argue that it's Gorbachev's sins of commission that cause all the problems, that his foreign policy mistakes are a function of his domestic policy mistakes, and together it kills the Soviet Union. So the big bozo was playing with plastic bags, and he stuck one on his head, so it was suicide by mistake. Others would argue, no, it's not about sins of commission, it's about sins of omission, what the Army failed to do. I mean, they would argue the Red Army should have done the Deng Xiaoping solution, send in the tanks, and just sort out problems that way. So they would argue that timely tank deployments, TTD, this is my contribution to military acronyms, would have changed the outcome of the Cold War. All right, others would say, no, it's not sins of omission, still it's sins of commission, but by this charmer, Boris Yeltsin, who's Gorbachev's successor, what did Boris do? He got rid of, I think it's Article 6 in the Soviet Constitution, which had given the Communist Party the monopoly of power. Now you're going to have multi-party competitions. And also, he got together with the heads of Belarus and Ukraine and signed a formal document, the Belavezha Accords, that dissolves the Soviet Union. So by this way of reasoning, it's suicide on purpose. All right. I can now give you a couple of umbrella explanations. One of them is any of the above reasons I've just given you. It's inevitable, or all of the above. It barely one. Here's how that goes. Let's start with any of the above. There were so many problems with the Soviet Union that you could argue that its demise was inevitable. It was just brutally inefficient. This is why the West didn't like it in the beginning. It wasn't that any U.S. president did anything. It's the Russians finally figured it out, and they invented it, and they wanted to get rid of it. So the Soviet Union was destined to lose. That's an optimistic way of looking at it. Here's a pessimistic way of looking at it. It's like, no, no, no. The Cold War ended very much on Western terms because it required all of these factors, the whole list that I gave you today. And you remove any one of them, and you get a different outcome. And you might, maybe you don't even end the Cold War. It took the whole shebang. So the West barely won the Cold War. Another twist on this one is say, not only did it take the whole shebang, but you needed these two gentlemen to be in office at the same time. George Bush, quite a resume. He'd had stints in Congress, a representative of China, representative of the UN, and then, of course, he'd been vice president under Reagan for 8 years. So he's very well qualified. And Helmut Kohl was the longest-serving chancellor of West Germany since his illustrious predecessor, Bismarck. And they worked on fast-tracking this. As soon as Helmut Kohl came into power, he decided to unify with East Germany by one tourist at a time. How does that work? East Germans love to travel, but they didn't like to return home. And all of a sudden, East Germany starts easing the travel restrictions in 1988. And you go, why? And the answer would be money. Helmut started paying them big money to let more people out. And he also gave the Hungarians big money to let East Germans out through the Austrian border that way. But then he and Bush do tag team diplomacy, where they are doing it so fast, and they're offering really big money to Gorbachev that he can't react, and the Soviet economy is imploding, and they desperately need the cash. So they get Gorbachev to agree first to German unification, second to unification with West Germany and NATO, and thirdly, unification with both halves in NATO, and by paying big money. But, complicating factor, a month and a half before the reunification treaty was signed, you get Saddam Hussein invading Iraq, and Iraq was a major Soviet client state, owed the Soviets between $10 and $13 billion. That's a lot of money for a broke creditor. But Bush finesses this problem. He doesn't go too far into Iraq to upset the Soviets. He also finesses these two. This is Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of Britain and President François Mitterrand of France. Neither one of them wanted to see a unified Germany. Why? Because it would eclipse their own countries. They were correct. But so François Mitterrand eventually finds solace by negotiating the Maastricht Treaty that's going to create the European Union, that's going to bring in all the Eastern European countries and merge it with the European community. But Margaret Thatcher just plain lost out. She wanted to retain some Soviet troops in Germany for the duration. Imagine dealing with Putin today if they'd had their way. They didn't. Okay, that's it for the underlying geopolitics and for what was done the last time around. Now what do we do? All right, in the first half, what I talked about elephant hunting, I talked about how the British ran their elephant hunting strategy, which they did quite well when they applied it to World War II. But there's a huge difference now. It's precision nuclear strike. None of us has a vulnerable homeland anymore. And so by all means, keep the economy running, and probably your friends' economies running. And by all means, close down enemy trade. But you probably don't want to do it with blockades and commerce raiding. Much better with sanctions. Sanctions is, I'm going to buy stuff or I'm not going to buy stuff. I'm going to sell stuff or I'm not going to sell stuff. You can do all of that. And then on peripheral theaters, of course you want to help out people who are beleaguered by continental problems. But you're going to have to be cautious about how this is done. The goal of maintaining prosperity hasn't changed. If you think about how it worked last time around, the West, Japan, South Korea, all together parried the nuclear threat. No one threw a nuclear bomb at anyone. All maintained economic growth. And so as the maritime world is compounding economic growth, the communists are living in compounded poverty of their own making. And so lest you despair on all of this, understand that people in the West during the Cold War, not everybody, but most people were living quite well, certainly much better than compared to how the communists were living. So that there was prosperity while all this was going on. So you can keep doing these things. I dare say the current Cold War is going to be going on for generations because you don't change how other people think. They decide changing what they thought. Gorbachev and his generations changed their minds of what they wanted to do. Deng Xiaoping and his generation changed their minds of what they wanted to do. And it'll probably take the Russians and the Chinese a long time to change. So if you look at from the Cold War section, I talked about all the reasons for why the war was won or lost, but you can extract what U.S. strategy was. Extensive military buildup with allies, also a very broad strategic communications campaign. It wasn't just human rights at the end, but from the very beginning, it's getting accurate news to subject populations, Radio Free Europe, Radio Voice of America, et cetera. And then a lot of alliance building for friends and alliance busting for enemies. And what you want to do is amplify overextension of your enemy, of all the stupid things they're doing. In the case of the Soviet Union, it was they're overextended by, it's not efficient to occupy someone else's country and stay there forever. And also the Russians were quite abusive, and we leveraged that. And of course, they had a non-performing economic model. And so you want to amplify those errors. Also, geography, without us lifting a finger, naturally contains Russia and China. They're surrounded by narrow seas. It's just facts. And the one up north, there's not much going on up there. Those narrow seas, in peacetime, it's great. Doesn't matter. The traffic goes. But if you're going to do a hot war, the merchant traffic doesn't go, and your Navy won't go if you're located on a really narrow sea. And if you look at Putin and Xi and whoever else is bothering you lately, it isn't a coherent alliance system. You've got basically a bunch of Eurasian dictators. Sure, they share the United States as a shared secondary enemy, but think who the primary enemies are. Russia's primary enemy right now is Ukraine. China's primary enemy, I don't know. Is it Taiwan? Is it India? Or if they do some Belt Road something, is it somebody up there? But it's not us. Iran's primary enemy is Israel. Pakistan's is India. North Korea, South Korea. None of this aligns for anyone to make meaningful sacrifices for the others. Whereas you compare the World War II alliance system, there's an agreement, Germany primary theater, Germany primary enemy, whereas the Axis, different primary theaters, different primary enemies, and they disperse their resources accordingly. Moreover, in our own day, we got Vladimir Putin, who's trying to reconstitute an empire in the age of nationalism. Good luck with that one. Dominated peoples no longer sit supine and take it. They resist. And you could look at this Belt Road Initiative as Vladimir Putin is taking his nuclear, well, not his nuclear, but his arsenal and dumping it into Ukraine. It's leading him wide open to Siberia, to Chinese ambitions. And China is busy peeling away from the Russian, the Tsarist, and the Soviet sphere of influence in Central Asia. That's what that Belt Road thing is. It's quite threatening for Putin, not so much for us. So also, if you think in the last Cold War, when the Russians kept it cold, right? They fought proxy wars. Other people do the fighting. Vladimir Putin is doing the fighting himself. And, oh, by the way, in the last Cold War, when the Russians were smart enough not to do too much of the fighting, Russia was strong, China was weak. Now those tables have turned. And you go, well, why would that matter? And not only does Siberia have loads of resources that China would like, and, oh, by the way, if you look at what the territories that the Romanov dynasty took from the Chinese, it exceeds U.S. territory east of the Mississippi. And you think the Chinese have forgotten, not so much. Putin says boundary treaties don't matter, right? Because it's ripped up to it's with Ukraine and these historic things that what matter. Well, the Chinese can play that back at him because the key resource right now that Siberia has is water. North China has blown through its water table, and Baikal has 20% or more than that of the world's surface freshwater, and the Chinese can, you can pipe it down if you would like to. So good luck, good old Vladimir Putin. The question isn't when the Sino-Russian relationship's going to break up, but when. And here's the problem with misidentifying your primary adversary and fighting a recreational war where you don't need to. Nicholas II tried this. He decided that Japan was his primary enemy, and off he goes to the Russo-Japanese War. Great, buddy. So instead of investing in railways and armaments production to deal with Germany, which comes and destroys his dynasty 10 years later, he's fighting Japanese. Well, Putin is doing emptied out his Cold War arsenals on Ukraine. And the Ukrainians never were after Russian territory. The Chinese might well be. So if we play our cards right, the Russians and the Chinese will take care of each other. But we're going to be on a long wait while this occurs. And it is better off to have more friends rather than fewer friends in this kind of world. And the maritime order, as flawed as it is your best bet to work with allies and friends through international institutions to coordinate against these crazy people. All right, well, that summarizes what I had to say today. And thank you for taking time late in the day to listen to me talk. But I'm happy to answer any questions you all might have.
Okay, we're going to pass out the pop quizzes, and nobody gets home unless you get an 80. So, now, no quiz, but do you have any questions? Got time for about 1 or 2 questions.
And I'll hang around afterwards and talk to anybody who wants to.
Sir.
Matt Young, Army, and I'm a senior student here at the Naval War College. So Bush, he wins in Iraq, then presides over the closing of the basically the closeout of the Cold War and the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then he's immediately not reelected. What does that say about us as the United States and our ability to focus long-term on any type of geopolitical strategy?
Okay, the question is Bush Sr., who very successfully negotiates the end of the Cold War, and then he's very promptly not reelected. And what does this say about us? A lot of things are not visible until the fullness of time. For instance, I was wondering about, well, are we in another Cold War? And a decade in, I can tell you, particularly with Putin's invasion, the 2022 event, I can say absolutely, I believe, maybe I'll be wrong. Whereas in 2012, you go, eh. And then 2014 looks more like it. So a lot of it is it takes time. And a lot of the decisions that we all make, both the good ones and the bad ones, take a long time for their implications to be felt. For instance, President Eisenhower invests in the highway system. And part of that, the idea was to have the highways wide enough so you could land planes anywhere you want. Well, not anywhere, they're bridges. But to protect the country, you'd have airfields everywhere. And actually, what that does is it allows all kinds of economic development all over the United States. But it takes a long time for all that to happen. So, for instance, recently there's been a lot of investment in internet, right? To get internet to all the rest of the country. And we'll see whether that has any implications or not. And it'll be 10 years where you go, okay, that was a big nothing sandwich, or no, it's, so I think that's a lot of it. And also, this is foreign policy. Americans focus on domestic policy, right? And I think what Americans don't understand today is their security depends on this maritime order. Think about it. You take your little piece of plastic, you go wherever it is in the world, and then you take that little plastic and you go, I want to buy this thing or whatever, and they give it to you, right? And so you've traded plastic, which is nothing, and oh, they even give you the plastic back, a little piece of paper you get, and then you take the good with you. Well, that only works in a rules-based order, right? We take it for granted. You take it for granted in a business when you sign a contract with, I don't know where it is, that they honor it. If they don't, you're going to have to send armies and things and do gumbo diplomacy. How expensive? So your security is dependent on this maritime order. I don't think Americans today have a clue about it. And that is why I'm out here lecturing. I think it's important that you understand this. And then what decisions you make afterwards is your business. Any other questions? I've cowed you all into submission. It was so boring you can't think of anything?
Hardly boring. Hardly
one in the
boring.
back? Yes. Brave person.
Brendan Nagel, United States Marine Corps. Thanks for your lecture. Your discussion of the greatest generation, they shared a formative experience of catastrophic paradigm changing events, 2 world wars, and how that set the stage for their strategy for the Cold War. I'm wondering if there's, when we're trying to extract lessons from the first Cold War to the second Cold War, if there's changes we need to account for because it just kind of snuck up on us. We didn't have that necessarily formative catastrophic ability.
Okay, so the question is about greatest generations, whether it requires a catastrophic event in order to come up with good ideas, and how we need to think about things to deal with the second Cold War. Well, I have a question about human beings. I don't know if human beings require a catastrophic disaster in order to get real. Because you get the Marshall Plan, which is big bucks. There's no way you would have gotten Americans to agree to that after World War I. After World War I, we're all about collecting our debts, give us the money back, give us the money back. And then we get World War II, and maybe we should have given more money back, and it would have been so much cheaper. So the question is whether human beings require a catastrophic disaster in order to get real. I hope not, but we all know hope isn't a strategy. But second, your generation is tremendously important for those of you who are veterans of Afghanistan and Iraq, because you have really important lived experience about what works and what doesn't work. And I don't know whether you're the greatest generation or the next one in the making, if you can make wise decisions and learn from your experience. And also, I urge you to publish. This is how one generation passes the baton to the next generation. Write down what your experiences are, and analyze them. And you can write short things in military journals that your peers will see. It's important. So we're in dangerous times. Americans need to stop fighting with each other and treat each other with respect and kindness and honesty and work together. And if we do scorched earth on ourselves and our allies, that is a strategy of suicide, and others will assist us gladly if we play that game.
Thank you very much.